October 25th, 1415, northern France, near the village of Agincourt. It had rained for days. The ground was no longer soil, it was mud. Thick, clinging, ankle-deep mud that swallowed boots, slowed horses, and punished every step forward. There were forests on both sides of the field, closing the space into a narrow corridor. No room to maneuver, no room to retreat. Across this strip of soaked earth stood the French army. Around 25,000 men, thousands of armored knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, men raised to believe that battle was decided the moment a knight lowered his lance. To the French nobility, this was not a question of if they would win, only how quickly. Facing them, about 6,000 English soldiers, exhausted, hungry, sick from weeks of marching. Most of them were not knights. They were archers, farmers, tradesmen, men with bows instead of armor. By every rule of medieval warfare, this should have been a massacre. Knights were the battlefield elite. They trained for war from childhood. They wore steel from head to toe. They were fast, violent, and devastating in open ground. Archers were support troops, useful but not decisive. They were meant to weaken an enemy before the real fight began. No one expected them to end it. The French certainly didn't. They had the numbers, they had the armor, they had the cavalry. Most importantly, they had confidence. At the center of the French line stood the heart of that confidence, the noble class itself, dukes, counts, princes, the men who defined French power. Their presence was not just military, it was symbolic. France did not fight as an army, it fought as a hierarchy. And that hierarchy believed one thing absolutely. A knight charging on horseback could not be stopped by common men on foot. Across the field, the English knew something the French did not. They were not there to win a traditional battle. They were there to survive one. King Henry V understood the situation clearly. He did not have the men to trade blows. He did not have the strength to absorb losses. He did not have the time to retreat. So he made a decision that looked defensive, almost desperate. He ordered his army to stop, to dig in. The English longbowmen drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of their positions. Simple tools, crude defenses, nothing a confident knight would take seriously. The French watched this and smiled. To them, it looked like fear, a smaller army bracing itself for the inevitable. What they didn't realize was that Henry was not preparing to resist the French charge. He was preparing to trap it. The French plan was straightforward. Advance, charge, crush. Overwhelming force would do the rest. It was the same logic that had worked for generations. But it depended on one assumption, that the battlefield would allow the French to fight the war they expected. It wouldn't. As the French began to advance, the mud revealed the truth. Horses slowed, men slipped, armor became a burden instead of protection. And then the English longbowmen began to fire. Not in volleys meant to intimidate, but in sustained, relentless waves. English longbowmen could loose 10 arrows a minute, some more, each shaft driven by years of training that turned muscle memory into precision. The sky darkened, not all at once, but constantly, a pressure that never let up. The French advance slowed to a crawl. Heavy armor, once a symbol of dominance, became a punishment. Every step sunk into the mud. Every attempt to regain speed failed. Horses strained, slipped, and panicked as arrows struck flanks, necks, and eyes. Riders fell. Those behind them had nowhere to go. Momentum died first. Order followed. French commanders shouted, standards waved, trumpets sounded. But sound doesn't move men when the ground itself refuses to cooperate. The narrow field compressed thousands of bodies into a single choking mass. Knights pressed forward not because it was smart, but because there was no room to do anything else. This was the moment the battle crossed a line. The French were no longer attacking. They were being fed into a problem. Those who reached the English line found something they hadn't prepared for: the stakes. Sharpened wooden posts angled toward the oncoming cavalry. Horses impaled themselves trying to force passage. Riders were thrown forward into the mud, stunned, vulnerable, tangled in armor they could barely move in. Behind them, more knights pushed forward, unaware that the charge had already failed. The field became a trap. And then the English longbowmen did something unexpected. They stopped shooting. Not because they ran out of arrows, but because the fight had changed. Archers dropped their bows and rushed forward with knives, mallets, and short swords. Not elegant weapons, brutal ones, tools meant for close, ugly work. They attacked fallen knights who could not arise. Men trained for mounted combat found themselves pinned face down in mud, suffocating under the weight of their own armor. This was not chivalry. This was physics. Armor that protected against swords did nothing against gravity and exhaustion. Knights fought to stand, failed, fought to breathe, failed again. French nobles died not because they were weak, but because the situation had stripped away every advantage they believed was permanent. And still they came. The French command made their fatal mistake here. Instead of halting the advance, instead of reassessing, they committed their second and third lines, more knights, more armor, more bodies into the same killing ground. They believed persistence would solve the problem. It only deepened it. Each new wave compressed the one before it. Fallen men were trampled, wounded men suffocated. Those who reached the front could not swing weapons effectively. There was no room, no leverage, no control. The English line held not because it was stronger, but because it did not move. King Henry V fought among his men, not directing from safety, fighting. His helmet dented, his crown knocked loose by a blow that nearly killed him. The king survived because his line did, and the line survived because the French nobility had already lost what mattered most: adaptability. Their entire military identity depended on one assumption, that shock cavalry decided battles. When that failed, there was no second plan, no alternative doctrine, no flexibility. What began as a confident advance had become a grinding disaster. Men stopped thinking in formations. They fought as individuals. Then they stopped fighting at all. Surrender became common. And that terrified the English. Because English numbers were small, guards were limited, and behind the French line, fresh troops still waited. Henry made the hardest decision of the day. He ordered many prisoners killed. Not out of cruelty, but fear. If the French rallied, the English would be overwhelmed from behind. The order was brutal, and it worked. The remaining French units hesitated. That hesitation was the last thing they could afford. Because once hesitation spreads in an army built on confidence, it doesn't stop. It collapses. By late afternoon, the battlefield was no longer contested. It was silent. Thousands of French nobles lay dead or captured. A generation of leadership wiped out in mud and confusion. England had not just won a battle, it had shattered a system. And Europe was about to understand what that meant.
When the fighting stopped, the scale of what had happened was impossible to ignore. The French army still existed on paper. Thousands of men were still alive. Banners still stood in the distance. But the core of French power was gone. Dukes, counts, princes, men who commanded not just armies, but loyalty. They lay dead, captured, or broken in the mud. And that mattered more than any casualty count. Because medieval France was not held together by institutions, it was held together by nobles who believed they were untouchable in battle. Agincourt destroyed that belief in a single day. The shock spread immediately. News traveled faster than armies ever could. Across France, towns waited for lords who would never return. Estates passed to heirs who had never commanded men. Political rivalries froze as no one was sure who actually held power anymore. France hadn't just lost a battle, it had lost confidence in its ruling class. England understood this instantly. Henry V didn't pursue the retreating French army. He didn't need to. His goal was never annihilation, it was legitimacy. Agincourt proved that England could survive, fight, and win on French soil against overwhelming odds. That victory reshaped negotiations, alliances, and perceptions across Europe. England was no longer the weaker kingdom clinging to claims. It was a force that had humiliated French nobility at the height of its power. And the lesson cut deeper than politics. Agincourt exposed a truth no knight wanted to hear. Armor could fail. Training could be irrelevant. Status did not guarantee survival. What mattered was adaptation. The English didn't win because the longbow was magical. They won because they refused to fight the battle France expected. Terrain mattered. Discipline mattered. Decision-making mattered more than tradition. Agincourt marked the beginning of the end for medieval shock warfare. Cavalry charges would never again be trusted blindly. Armies began to rethink formations, command structures, and the role of infantry. Power started shifting, slowly but permanently, away from aristocratic warriors and toward organized professional forces. That shift didn't happen overnight, but Agincourt made it unavoidable. And there was one final irony. The French had not been defeated by innovation alone. They had been defeated by certainty. Certainty that knights could not lose to common men. Certainty that numbers guaranteed victory. Certainty that tradition was enough. The English had no such certainty. They had no illusions to protect, only survival. And that made all the difference. What Agincourt revealed was not just a new way to fight, but a new way power could fail. Because once a system depends on belief more than reality, it only takes one day to expose it. And Europe would spend the next century adjusting to that exposure. The consequences of Agincourt didn't unfold slowly. They landed all at once. Within weeks, the French court was paralyzed. So many senior nobles were dead or captured that decision-making stalled. Ransoms bankrupted families. Power vacuums opened everywhere. Local lords hesitated to act because no one knew who truly spoke for the crown anymore. This was not just a military loss, it was an administrative one. France's system depended on its nobility being present, confident, and alive. Agincourt removed all three at the same time, and when that happened, the kingdom didn't know how to respond. Henry V exploited this perfectly. He didn't rush, he didn't gamble, he advanced deliberately, taking towns that now lacked leadership, securing supply lines, and presenting himself not as a raider, but as a legitimate ruler enforcing a claim. Agincourt had done the hard work for him. Resistance fractured before it could organize. French commanders avoided open battle. Garrisons surrendered early. Negotiations replaced challenges. The psychological weight of Agincourt hung over every decision like a warning, because no one wanted to be the next noble remembered for dying face down in the mud. But the deeper impact went beyond France and England. Across Europe, military thinkers paid attention. Agincourt wasn't dismissed as luck. It wasn't written off as weather. It forced an uncomfortable question. What if the knight was no longer the center of the battlefield? For centuries, European warfare had revolved around the mounted elite. Armor, breeding, training, entire social systems existed to support the idea that decisive power came from a narrow warrior class. Agincourt didn't erase that overnight, but it cracked it. Infantry suddenly mattered more. Terrain planning became essential. Commanders began thinking about how to deny the enemy their strengths instead of meeting them head-on. And most importantly, armies began to accept that discipline could outperform prestige. The longbow didn't win because it was superior technology alone. Crossbows existed. Firearms were emerging. What mattered was how the English used their tools inside a system designed for survival, not glory. France learned this lesson slowly, painfully. Repeated defeats followed, internal conflicts worsened, political instability deepened. The war dragged on, but it dragged on under conditions France had not prepared for. Agincourt had shifted the balance. Not decisively enough to end the war immediately, but enough to ensure it would never return to what it had been before. And that is what makes Agincourt so dangerous as a precedent. It proved that systems built on tradition collapse faster than systems built on adaptation. That lesson would echo far beyond medieval Europe, because once warfare stops being about who you are and becomes about what you can execute under pressure, no class, empire, or institution is safe forever. Agincourt wasn't the end of knights, but it was the end of believing they were invincible. And once that belief died, everything else began to change.
By the time Henry V left the field, Agincourt was already becoming something else. Not just a battle, a reference point. Every future commander would measure decisions against it, whether they admitted it or not. Because Agincourt exposed a weakness that had nothing to do with weapons. It exposed rigidity. The French had not lost because they lacked courage. They had not lost because their soldiers were inferior. They lost because their system could not bend when reality changed. Their army was designed to perform one act perfectly: charge, break the enemy, win. When that act failed, there was no fallback, no pause, no rethink, no alternative doctrine. And that is where power truly collapses. Henry V understood this better than most kings of his era. He knew Agincourt was not a miracle to be repeated blindly. It was a lesson to be exploited carefully. So he didn't rush to recreate it. Instead, he used its reputation. French towns surrendered at the memory of Agincourt. Garrisons negotiated instead of resisting. Commanders avoided decisive engagements entirely. The English army advanced not because it was unstoppable, but because no one wanted to face what might happen if the ground, the weather, and discipline aligned again. Agincourt became psychological terrain, and that terrain favored England. But the deeper shift was happening quietly. Across Europe, rulers began to question who they trusted with military power. Infantry formations expanded. Professional soldiers became more valuable than noble birth. Armies started to train for coordination instead of individual heroics. The battlefield was becoming less personal, more mechanical, more deliberate, more unforgiving. Agincourt didn't end chivalry as an idea, it stripped it of authority. Because once common soldiers could defeat elite warriors under the right conditions, the social contract of war began to unravel, and that terrified the ruling class. Power had always justified itself by claiming inevitability, that some people were born to command and others were born to follow. Agincourt proved that inevitability was conditional. Change the conditions, and everything changes. That realization didn't just affect military planning, it affected politics. Kings began centralizing control, nobles lost autonomy, armies became extensions of the state rather than reflections of aristocratic privilege. The medieval world didn't collapse overnight, but Agincourt pushed it firmly toward its end. And here's the final truth most summaries miss. Agincourt wasn't won by brilliance alone. It was won by humility. Henry V accepted his limitations. The French command did not. One side asked, "How do we survive?" The other asked, "How do we prove we are superior?" Only one of those questions leads to victory when conditions turn hostile. And that is why Agincourt still matters. Not because of arrows, not because of mud, but because it shows what happens when confidence outpaces adaptability. And in the next part, we'll confront the most uncomfortable question of all. If Agincourt changed warfare so deeply, why did so many powers continue to repeat the same mistakes anyway? Here's the part most people misunderstand. Agincourt did not instantly revolutionize warfare. If it had, history would be simple. But humans don't change systems just because they've been proven wrong once. They rationalize, they excuse, they pretend the conditions were unique. And that is exactly what happened. French chroniclers blamed the mud, the weather, bad luck, poor coordination, anything except the structure of their own power. Because admitting the truth would have meant admitting something dangerous, that noble birth no longer guaranteed battlefield dominance. So Europe tried to move on. Knights still charged, armor still gleamed, tradition still dictated command. But something subtle had shifted. Every cavalry charge after Agincourt carried doubt inside it. Commanders began asking new questions, quietly. What if the terrain turns? What if the enemy refuses to advance? What if momentum dies? These questions didn't replace old doctrine overnight. They infected it. And once doubt enters a system built on certainty, it never fully leaves. England understood this perfectly. Henry V did not try to prove Agincourt again and again. He didn't treat it as a formula. He treated it as leverage, a psychological weapon that made enemies hesitate before swords ever crossed. That hesitation was often enough. But Agincourt's deepest legacy wasn't tactical. It was structural. It showed that centralized discipline could outperform decentralized prestige, that coordination mattered more than individual excellence, that armies needed command unity, not social hierarchy, to survive complex battles. Over time, this logic reshaped Europe. Standing armies replaced feudal levies, professional officers replaced noble privilege. States learned to trust systems, not bloodlines. Agincourt didn't create these changes, it made them unavoidable. And there's another reason Agincourt still resonates. It's uncomfortable. Because it reminds us that most collapses don't begin with weakness. They begin with confidence that refuses to adapt. The French army was strong, well-equipped, brave, and still it failed. Not because it lacked power, but because it lacked flexibility. That lesson applies far beyond medieval battlefields. Any organization built on tradition alone eventually meets conditions it can't control. When it does, the question isn't how strong it is, but how quickly it can rethink itself. France couldn't do that at Agincourt. England did. And that is why 6 centuries later, this battle is still studied, not for its spectacle, but for its warning. Because power that believes it cannot lose eventually forgets how to win. And in the final part, we'll bring everything together. Why Agincourt wasn't an anomaly. Why it keeps repeating in different forms across history, and why the pattern it revealed is still shaping the world today.
Agincourt endures because it wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern. A pattern history repeats whenever power mistakes tradition for inevitability. The French believed they were unbeatable because they always had been. Their system rewarded lineage, spectacle, and confidence. It assumed the battlefield would always allow them to fight the war they preferred. Agincourt proved a brutal truth. Wars don't reward identity, they reward adaptation. The English did not invent a new world that day. They simply accepted the one they were in. Mud, exhaustion, narrow ground, none of it was heroic, but all of it was real. Henry V didn't ask his army to look impressive. He asked them to survive. And survival reshaped everything. That is why Agincourt still matters centuries later. Not because of arrows or weather, but because it exposes how systems fail. Power collapses when it becomes predictable. Authority collapses when it depends on reputation alone. Dominance collapses the moment it refuses to change. Every great military upset since Agincourt follows the same arc. A force built on tradition meets an enemy built on adjustment. Confidence meets preparation. Certainty meets reality. And reality always wins. This is why empires don't usually fall to weaker enemies. They fall to enemies who refuse to fight on familiar terms. Agincourt didn't end knighthood overnight. It didn't immediately erase feudalism, but it planted doubt where certainty once lived. And that doubt spread faster than any army. Once belief breaks, power follows. That is the real legacy of Agincourt. Not the number of dead, not the glory of victory, but the proof that no system survives unchanged once it's exposed. The French learned that lesson too late. England learned it just in time. And history has been repeating it ever since. Because whenever power assumes it cannot lose, it already has. If you enjoy battles where history turns on a single decision, subscribe for more moments that reshaped the world.